Phase 2 of the global recession is here. How do we know? Coordinated moves in one key macro statistic that's taking over the entire economic landscape. It's got governments and officials all over the world freaking out. China's only the first. Others are talking about not just rate cuts, but accelerating their schedule. It's been 1 year on since the bond rally started, and all that meant was more confidence in the market. The world was in for lower growth and inflation expectations. A full year later, stop and think about how much has changed, just in terms of the mainstream conversation. Earlier in the year, the idea of a no landing was everywhere. Then came the sticky CPIs. There was no arguing with higher for longer. Only a few months ago, the very idea of the Fed cutting rates was in question, only to see Jay Powell turn right around with a 50 basis point rate cut in September that he now has to downplay because people correctly understand the significance of that complete reversal. Again, how much has changed in this year alone? Not just this year, in just a few months. The thing is, the economy hasn't actually changed. Only awareness of its real situation has. And that comes down to a single macroeconomic variable, which is now keeping everyone up at night. The hawks have completely swapped feathers, but they're not doves now, they're chickens. From strong and resilient, soft landing, higher for longer, to holy crap, how fast do we need to cut, seemingly in the blink of an eye. Given what this one stat is doing in so many different places around the world, for once that actually makes sense. If only rate cuts did anyone any good. Officials are just freaking out about a whole bunch of macroeconomic risks that are captured in a single word, and that word is undershooting. But here's the thing. Undershooting isn't some future economic risk. It's happening right now, and it's happening in so many different places all over the world. Perfect example is Europe and the ECB, where the hawks over there, at least the former hawks, are suddenly going crazy for rate cuts. They started out saying, we're never even going to think about cutting rates until consumer prices are back at our target. Then suddenly in June, they said, well, we're going to cut rates, but it's because we're more confident in our forecasting ability. Translation, it wasn't forecasting ability, it was being aware of the major weakness that was brewing. The forecasting became easy. The economy wasn't picking up and it was falling over, and doing so very visibly. So now European central banks and all of its hawks are suddenly exceptionally dovish. What was supposed to be maybe a rate cut every other meeting is now turned into, do we need to cut at every meeting, and maybe do we need to cut extra at every meeting, including the position of well-known hawk and maybe the most hawkish member of the ECB Governing Council anywhere, Isabel Schnabel. Just yesterday, she said, yeah, we need to think strongly about cutting in October, just in a couple weeks. We cannot ignore the headwinds to growth, she said in Freiburg, Germany. With signs of softening labor demand and further progress in disinflation, a sustainable fall in inflation back to our 2% target in a timely manner is becoming more likely, despite still elevated services inflation and strong wage growth. As Bloomberg continued, the remarks from one of the ECB's top hawks highlight growing alarm among officials over an economic deterioration that may bring down consumer price growth more quickly than previously foreseen. And it's already happening all over Europe. As Schnabel herself added, over the past 18 months, the recovery has repeatedly been weaker than anticipated. And so they were expecting the economy to gently glide into a soft landing, or in Europe's case, to come out of its shallow recession, and consumer prices would gently descend down to their 2% target and then remain there for the longer run. Instead, what has happened is consumer prices were disinflating due to the supply shock, the downside of it, and then they seemed to get sticky earlier in the year, which officials interpreted, because they don't know what inflation is or where it comes from, they interpreted that as it getting stuck for the economy reasons or something for expectations. They misidentified energy and gasoline prices as renewed inflationary pressures, when in fact the economy continued to get weaker. In Europe, it never actually recovered. And now all of a sudden, consumer price rates aren't just falling down to the 2% target. Many of them are going below that target, and very quickly. That's what's causing the European officials and other officials around the world to suddenly become dovish as all hell. Just a few months ago, back in the middle of May, Schnabel sounded very different. In an interview with Nikkei, she said, but more importantly, the part of inflation that has become entrenched through second round effects is proving more persistent. Given the high uncertainty about the inflation outlook, we should give ourselves sufficient time to assess how the recovery is proceeding and how monetary policy affects economic growth and inflation. And just a couple months before that, back in February, rate cuts? What rate cuts? This is what Schnabel said, according to the Financial Times. Lower borrowing costs could reinvigorate the Eurozone stagnant economy, as if that's a bad thing, and cause inflation to flare up again, a senior European Central Bank official has warned. We must be patient and cautious because we know, also from historical experience, that inflation can flare up again. This is according to Isabel Schnabel. So she went from February, we're really concerned about inflation flaring up, it's too sticky, higher for longer, to May, well, at least the supply shock imbalances are all done, but we see second round and second order effects still sticking around, to now in October, holy crap, we need to cut every meeting. Again, they have changed their tune, not because the economy has changed, but because consumer price numbers have changed, consumer price conditions have changed. CPIs, and in Europe, the HICP, it's not about consumer prices or those numbers, it's what they represent. As Schnabel said, and as the Bloomberg description of Schnabel's speech said, it's the economic deterioration that's captured by what they call undershooting. Inflation, deflation, what's the real difference? And more importantly, how can you tell? It's clear central bankers don't know, but that's why Eurodollar University is here. And we've got our fall sale going on right now. We're offering an incredible discount where you can package all 3 of our subscriptions for the lowest price. You get the deep dive analysis, the daily briefing, and a Eurodollar University membership, all for one low price. If you want to know how the monetary system works, how it affects the economy and the markets, the DDA, the daily briefing, and the membership has it all covered from every angle. There are huge savings on individual subscriptions and memberships too. And the details about the fall sale and everything we offer can be found at our website, eurodollar.university. It's not just Europe. It's not just ECB. It's all over the place. It's all over the world. Suddenly over the summer, again, summertime keeps coming up in so many different ways. Suddenly over the summer, consumer price rates that look sticky have suddenly not just declined down to 2% targets, they've gone below in a whole variety of different places and under different circumstances, globally synchronized. This isn't about central bank rate hikes in South Africa or the Reserve Bank of India or the Federal Reserve or the Bank of Canada. This is a globally synchronized downside to the supply shock that is, as I said in the introduction, reaching the next stage. And the next stage includes central bankers freaking out because they got the first stage completely wrong. What they thought was strong and resilient actual recovery was nothing more than the price illusion, and that disinflation was never a good thing. That was always the bad news. And there's a huge difference between good disinflation, the kind that we saw in the 1990s and the early 2000s, and the disinflation associated with the silent depression that we got in the 2010s. And I'll go over those differences in a little bit here. But first, disinflation is showing up, aggressive disinflation, accelerating declines in consumer prices over the summer, showing up everywhere. It started in Europe, but again, remember the quote here. Growing alarm among officials over an economic deterioration that may bring down consumer price growth more quickly than previously foreseen. Again, this is not a risk. This is happening right now, and it's happening in Europe. We'll start there. Europe's HICP for September was negative, and September is usually a month where it's pretty positive, pretty substantially positive. That makes 3 months in a row with very little increase in Europe's main consumer price measurement. Year over year, the rate fell in September to 1.75%, down from 2.15%, and it had been 2.58% in July. So a substantial move, turning down, causing central bankers like well-known hawk Isabel Schnabel to completely change her tune about what the ECB stance should be. One reason why, because of Germany. German consumer prices, this is the CPI in September, was basically unchanged. It had been down a little bit in August and had been basically flat going back to May and June. So summertime with very little consumer price gains, in fact, a little bit of decline in August. So the year-over-year rate in Germany 1.6%. It was 1.9% the month before, and it had been 2.3% back in July. And it had been 3.7% in December. So cutting that rate in more than half, with most of that decline coming just over the summertime. Not just Germany, in France, the French CPI for the month of September down to 1.2% year over year. It had been 1.8% just the month before that and 2.3% in July. And like Germany, 3.7% last December. Tremendous change in disinflation. That brings with it, first of all, recognition from central bankers that something bad's going on here because, again, undershooting in consumer price targets with consumer price measures is not really about consumer prices. It's about the economic deterioration that is captured and that an increasingly rapid disinflation. Therefore, what that means is exactly what the markets have been pricing. Moving a little bit further, Switzerland, not part of the European economy, but in Europe, Switzerland, the Swiss CPI for September was less than 1% year over year, down to 0.8%, which was well below expectations for 1.1%, which was the same 1.1% that the CPI put up in August. And it had been 1.3% in July, so substantial downturn in Swiss consumer price growth, which is already significant because Swiss consumer prices aren't all that high to begin with. So the fact that they're already low and now going a lot lower and very quickly too, globally synchronized, is another warning sign. That's why the Swiss are talking about accelerating their rate cuts from the Swiss National Bank. Moving outside of Europe, Canada, our friends at the bank up north in the Bank of Canada. Their CPI for the month of August was right at 2%, so not quite undershooting, but you can see here how quickly that has decelerated too. From 2.9% back in May and 3.4% in December, right down to 2%, and the Bank of Canada knows it's not going to stick right at 2%. It's going to go underneath. Now, what they all hope, is that by cutting rates, that will shore up the economy and the labor markets, and then as consumer price rates go below their targets, they come back up and just stick right around where they want them to, when history shows that's not how this works. Once consumer prices rapidly decelerate, it raises the risk of silent depression type of disinflation. And that's why they're freaking out. Outside of North America, how about Asia, South Korea? The South Korean CPI was 1.6% in the latest figures for the month of September. It had been 2.6% just a couple months ago and was above 3% last December. Again, globally synchronized. You see the theme here? South African CPI, which is much higher, is at 4.4% year over year in the month of September, but it had been 5.1% a couple months ago and nearly 6% in February. So even in places where consumer prices are still growing rapidly, they're coming down pretty substantially too. And that's especially the case in India. The Indian CPI was 3.65% in August. It had been 3.6% in July, but those are the first 2 months where consumer prices in India have risen at a rate less than 4% since 2019. So the first time in 5 years that Indian consumer prices had grown by less than 4%. Again, substantial disinflation that has shown up more recently. Why? It's the very reason why central bankers are increasingly dovish. They want to cut rates and accelerate the rate cuts because they understand at the very least that when consumer prices behave like this, it's nothing good. As I said about the US CPI back in July, for the June CPI, a whole marching band of red flags. Now we're seeing marching bands all over the world. How about the latest from the United States? The PCE deflator, which came out last week. This is for the month of August. That was right around 2.24% year over year, but that was down from 2.45% in July. The last several months of the PCE deflator have been thoroughly disinflation, in fact, too disinflationary. The 4-month change in the PCE deflator was just 0.35%, which is the lowest 4-month rate of this cycle so far. And do the math here. That means the PCE deflator is rising at just barely a 1% annual rate over these last 4 months. So that's well less than the Fed's target, and it's down in the same territory, suggesting the bad type of disinflation. Same with the CPI. I mentioned that before. The CPI, its 4-month change was just 0.29%, which is also the lowest that we've seen so far. Too much disinflation, and now central bankers, and even the hawkish central bankers, know it. It may seem wild and radical, but there are two different kinds of disinflation. It's not really the disinflation. Again, it's what those consumer price changes actually represent. We had the disinflation in the 1990s and early 2000s in the United States and around the rest of the world, which was called the Great Moderation. And to be honest, economists have no idea where this came from. They've been struggling trying to answer where the Great Moderation, what made the Great Moderation so idyllic to begin with. Never got too high, nor did it get too low. There were a couple occasions where it dipped down, like the 1997-98 Asian financial crisis. But for most of the period, by and large, consumer prices were basically gentle. And you look at the difference. If we just take the PCE deflator from January of 1992, so we're not even counting the latter part of the 80s and early part of the 1990s, just from 1992 through September 2008, before we get to the big deflationary crash in September and October 2008. During that period, which amounted to 16 years, so we're talking about more than a decade and a half, the PCE deflator, the average annual change was just 2.2%. And think about the world during that period. Everybody knows very well that it was a legitimately booming expansionary period, unparalleled prosperity in a lot of places around the world. This is one reason why central bankers picked around 2% for their target, because it seemed like when consumer prices are consistent at around that level, things go really well. But then look at the decade after 2008 and 2009. We'll just use the average here. We won't even use 2009, though we should. We'll start with January 2010 to December 2019. The PCE deflator during that decade averaged 1.53%. And that doesn't sound like a big difference. 2.2% before 2008, 1.53% afterward. But there is a world of difference in those two averages, not just the mathematics, the 0.7 of a percentage point that's different. We've got more government interference. We've got stimulus everywhere. We've got zero interest rates because of the market, as well as by central bank policies. We got multiple QEs. We got governments doing everything, and consumer prices that are consistently lower than they were before. We've got lower labor participation. We've got far lower GDP growth. We've got far lower job growth. Governments do more. Central banks do more, and it doesn't work. Because there is a huge difference between the disinflation of the 2010s, the silent depression, and the Great Moderation disinflation, which was when the monetary system was working. So central bankers want to go back to the disinflation of the pre-crisis era, and they think they've got it. But now we're seeing a shift in consumer prices today that is more consistent with going back into the 2010s silent depression version, and they're freaking out about that possibility because they realize that in that possibility is a whole bunch more than just consumer price changes. It's all about the economic circumstances that eventually come out in consumer prices. So that's what they really mean by undershooting. It's not really about prices at all. It's what those represent for a whole bunch of other critical factors that they don't identify and never talk about. We're talking about monetary factors as well as globally synchronized financial circumstances. And that includes shadow money conditions that they always ignore until, like now, it shows up in the CPI. So they thought CPIs were sticky, they thought higher for longer, and then they see them start to go down quickly. And that's why their attitude has changed. Again, it's not about the CPI. It's about what that CPI represents as far as short-run economic potential, but more importantly, the long run. Are we going to make it to the 1990s, 2000s version of disinflation, moderation, stability? Or are we heading back toward the 2010s version of disinflation, which nobody should want? So just look at how much the conversation has shifted in just a few months. The economy didn't actually change. It's been heading in this direction the whole time. Awareness of it changed because the second phase of the globally synchronized recession has begun. It's not really a recession either. It's simply the downside of the supply shock reaching toward its inevitable end, its terminal state. And that terminal state is pictured in bond markets, the rally that began last year, and it's also been pictured in consumer price numbers. Consumer price numbers that are falling too far and too fast. There's too much disinflation in them. It's even freaking out governments and central bankers. China's massive stimulus rush makes a whole lot more sense once you realize what's really going on around the world. I talked about the Beijing bazooka in the video link below. As always, thank you very much for joining me. Check out Eurodollar University's fall sale. Huge thank you, Eurodollar University members and subscribers. And until next time, take care.